Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Not Just Politics podcast. Today is Friday, May 23rd. I am here in the nation's capital. Pete Hegseth, there was a group chat.
There was a group chat.
Pete Hegseth, I just got a text one day, and it was a group chat, and I think Pete Hegseth was in there, and he said, hey, you have to come to D.C. We're talking about war plans at a bar. And so I showed up.
You were the natural one to reach out to about it.
I'm the leading journalist in America.
Yeah.
So with no journalism degree. And so, of course, I showed up because that's not a problem, as it turns out, in this country. It's not a problem to put the editor-in-chief of a big newspaper, which I am one, into a group chat discussing war plans. That's not an issue.
Apparently not.
Based on what we've seen. So,
and do you know what? It seems like nobody really cares after
a few weeks. Yeah, that's also our memory is so short. So I suspect that I won't really face any. I get to drop an article, a fire Substack.
Yep.
About being put in a group chat.
Yep.
And
Ken Klippenstein will be so jealous.
Yeah, everyone's gonna be real upset.
Yeah.
That I got that and not them, because that's what people don't understand about the media industry is that people don't like journalists. They wouldn't be like, I can't believe you did that. They're like, I can't believe it wasn't me.
And that's the difference between the legacy media and the podcasters, right? Because the podcasters, I feel like, are all in it for each other. I don't feel like they compete.
No,
for
they
those
would
kind of
they would be jealous too.
You think so?
I suspect so.
Okay.
I do. But anyway, so that was a little bit of a thing. So anyway, I just figured, why not go visit friend of the show, Jeremiah Cutright.
Yep.
He's here. So thank you for letting us use your apartment to film. How have you been?
Good. It's been really cool being here in DC for the past year.
Mm-hmm.
I always forget that Orange Man is like
right down the way,
right down the street.
Well, yeah. I have a meeting. I think he was also in the group chat that I was.
Yeah, probably. Yes, you'll probably get to see him before I do.
I'll probably get to see him.
I was like driving down the street a couple weeks ago, and the presidential convoy was coming down the other way of the road, and they like pushed all the cars to the side and everything, and that was kind of cool. I know that it would
defeat the purpose, but are you kind of, has he at least suggested wrapping isn't it called the Beast? Isn't that the name of the car?
Yeah, I think so.
Has he suggested wrapping that in an American flag?
Oh, that would
Aiden Ross gave him that Cybertruck wrapped in the American. Did you see that? Aiden Ross gave him a Cybertruck wrapped in the American flag and the photo of him holding up the fist after he got shot.
Wow.
As like a stunt. I'm surprised he hasn't suggested that we do.
And on like Air Force One as well. Imagine how nice of a wrap you could make on it. The one that Boeing was working on is
the one that Qatar is apparently trying to give him.
Oh, really? I don't know anything about this. I don't know.
You haven't heard anything about this at all?
No, I don't know about this at all.
This is hilarious that I'm the one breaking this.
Yeah, no, tell me about it.
From what I understand, Qatar is gifting him a brand new Boeing 747 to be the new Air Force One. And he is going to accept it, and he plans on keeping it after he leaves office as well. That's the plan. And then multiple newspapers correctly were like, wait a minute, there's ethical problems here, there's many problems, and now he's like threatening to sue them because they reported on it. This is the guy we got.
Government employees aren't supposed to like accept a dinner or something like that from a sponsor. Like they're like really harsh on it. But they're not allowed to accept like a burger from somebody, but he's getting a jet.
It's a jumbo jet.
A jumbo jet.
It's huge.
Nice.
And the claim is that this saves the American taxpayer money because we don't have to pay for a new Boeing 747.
That's one way to spin it. Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
Anyway, so it's been a while. The last time we saw you was in Chicago.
Yeah.
For the Bridge USA Summit. That was in July of last year.
Okay, so it's been about a year.
Yeah, it's been about a year since we've spoken, and we did marvel at Trump Tower quite a bit. I mean,
it was the best building in the city.
Yeah, I don't say that.
Chicago had some amazing architecture, and
beautiful.
it just stood out among the rest of them.
It was whenever we walked out, and I don't know exactly what part of the city we were in, but when we walked out of our hotel room, it was basically the first and only thing you could put your eyes on. It was just right off to the left.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was by far the biggest building in sight.
Yep,
by a mile.
At the base, it was probably the widest, and it was definitely the tallest.
It was huge.
Yeah.
And of course, there's giant Trump in gold written across the front.
It just went so hard.
And we were there for the Bridge USA summit. And when I was talking to Manu, the CEO of Bridge USA, I was like, dude, why are we not across the street? And he was like, I considered it. Or whatever he said. They were like, listen, I was like, did you at least get like a quota for how much they would have charged you to do it? Because I think that would have been very funny. But anyway, so we're just going to talk about energy stuff today.
Sure.
And so you are a security, and for those who don't know, you are a security and energy analyst.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I pitch myself these days.
And you just graduated from Georgetown, so congratulations on that.
Thank you. Yeah,
sir.
my master's of science in international energy security policy. So
that's all very
it's a cool degree.
So we're just going to jump right in. There's been an exciting fusion battle happening between China and France, as I understand.
China and the West, I would say.
Sure, the West. Okay. Could you break this down for us?
Sure. So we were talking about this last night a bit too.
Yeah.
Like there's this new type of race going on between China and the West right now. And last night, we were talking about it in relation to AI and AGI, but the same thing is happening with fusion as well. There's like multiple technological, and with quantum as well, with quantum computing.
Yeah.
There's like multiple, and space. There's multiple different overlapping technological races going on right now. And fusion is a really interesting one to me because a lot of these things we're going to be doing, especially like AI and quantum computing, they just require energy.
So much.
Energy is an amplifier on top. It allows you to do whatever you're trying to do in other dimensions, right? And fusion is, I'm sure a lot of people understand, it's like the holy grail kind of energy.
Yes.
It's, as with our current understanding of physics, like these fusion power is the best form of energy we could imagine, the most powerful form of energy. Limitless clean energy. It's like, the utopian dream is fusion. And China needs energy. We need energy. And we want to be the ones to dominate that energy sector for the world moving forward, right? Like whoever has controlled oil has had a huge control over global politics. Same thing is kind of happening with critical minerals right now, which maybe we can get to later. Mm-hmm. But there's this race with fusion, and it's so cool because the West, especially like the US and Europe, led on fusion for decades and decades. The Soviet Union was in on it, but they never really quite got it in the same way the West did. And there was this perpetual joke about fusion that it's always 30 years away.
Yes. We talked about that when you were on here with Dr. Mullen.
Yeah, I'm sure we did.
2 years ago.
Because that was the chapter of that was the title of the chapter of my book. Fusion.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to see over the past 10 years especially is, even though people still say this, I think the spell has genuinely been broken now. Because the really important metric to follow with fusion, there's a couple, but one of them is how long you're able to sustain the plasma in the fusion for, right? And so for decades and decades, we were making progress was measured in like nanoseconds or milliseconds, right? And now every couple years, we're increasing it by like minutes or,
even by the week, it seems like they were increasing it by minutes.
And kind of like the funniest thing to all of this is that the reactors setting records right now are predominantly between one in China and one in the West. I'm not sure exactly where it's based.
I think it's in France.
I think it's in France as well. It's either France or the UK. But the one in China is acronymed East.
Yes.
And the one in France is acronymed West.
Which is very
Which is like, I don't know any more about the naming scheme than that. I don't know if they did this intentionally, And
if that was by accident, that's quite the accident.
It's something to be written in a book about, for sure. I'll write about this in the future more. But what's so funny is that these two reactors, like every year or every few months even, just keep setting new records on top of each other.
Yeah.
And the headlines have been crazy. There's also other types of fusion reactors, like the U.S. has at the NIF, the National Ignition Facility. They're setting new records for a new type of nuclear fusion, which is like ignition fusion, which is kind of a whole another technology.
What we're talking about with these ones in France and China is
these are tokamaks, which contain plasma in like a donut
with
shape,
magnets.
with magnets, right? With the craziest magnets
that
in
we
the
can come up with.
world.
And what are those made of? Like neodymium?
They might be neodymium. I don't actually know what they're superconducting magnets, so they have to get cooled to like a crazy degree for the properties. Here's a fun fact about them. With the reactor in France that's going to hopefully start, which is International Project ITER, that's the one that's hopefully going to start in the next 5 or 10 years or so, even though it's kind of outdated already. And China and the West are collaborating on that one together. The temperature difference from the center of the plasma, which is the hottest thing we know about in the known universe, as far as I understand it, because it has to be so hot for us to fuse it.
Because we lack the gravity.
Because we lack the gravity that stars have, exactly.
So we have to make it like 10 times hotter than the surface of the sun to get the conditions necessary to turn 2 hydrogen atoms into a helium.
Because we don't have the gravity forcing them together, we have to compensate by making them move even faster in the plasma. So it's like one of the hottest things we know about in the whole universe. And then just like, 10, 20 meters away are these superconducting magnets, which are being cooled to almost absolute zero. So the temperature gradient is the most extreme in like the universe. As far as we can I can't imagine where it would be more extreme. So it's kind of like crazy technology. I mean, it's totally insane. But it's cool that there's this race going on between China and the U.S. because it's, as far as I see it, this is like a very healthy form of race.
Yeah, right.
Like fusion, we had fusion bombs, 80 years ago, 60, 80 years ago at this point. I don't think anybody's seriously worried about anything bad happening from this race, Worst case scenario, your opponent gets this magical technology working before you do, and then they just make the world better on their terms a little bit, right? But it's essentially limitless clean energy. I don't think that anyone's going to necessarily complain about that coming onto the world stage one way or another. We just want us to be dictating the, who's buying it, how we're going to export it and stuff. So it's a cool race. I'm happy to see it.
I think it's really cool. So let's just say for the sake of the conversation that tomorrow we figured it out.
Yeah.
And we could sustain one of these reactions indefinitely.
Yeah.
How long do you think it takes for the world to pick up on that and get going with it?
It's like for it to reach any significant portion of like global electricity or something.
Yeah, like of energy portfolios of countries.
Yeah,
like how quickly?
It's going to take a long time.
Sure.
It's going to be decades for sure. When you look at the build out of nuclear fission, for example, that happened over about 3 decades from the, really like the 60s to the 90s in most of the West. And in the country that was most aggressive with it, which was the U.S., although France built a lot themselves too. 3 decades in, and the U.S. was getting 20% of their electricity. And we had the biggest fleet in the world. We still have the biggest fleet in the world. It's so big, it just takes a really long time. But what's great about having this technology is that, the ship can start to turn. Even if it's going to take a long time, it's going to begin. And fusion is also so... It's arguably more scalable than fission. Because you don't have the safety concerns you do with fission, right?
Right.
So it's more complicated, which will make it, that it's more complicated than fission, which will make it harder to do and build out with these magnets and whatnot.
Sure.
But at least you don't have the safety concerns.
And the public fear around meltdowns and explosions is hopefully
going to go away. I'll be really curious to see how that evolves over time because the public has, radiophobia is this term in the literature that you see, which is that people are irrationally afraid of radiation, and especially sources of radiation that relate to nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. Like when you compare it, if a certain dosage of radiation will give you like this chance of dying or having some illness form from it. When you compare that to other sorts of toxins, chemicals, just like air pollution, general hazards in life, car crashes, people are way, way more scared of radiation than they are of these other sources.
Which they're much more likely to actually get harmed.
Which they're yeah, exactly right. So there's this strain, and there's a lot of reasons why this might be the case, but hopefully we're able to not let that legacy impact nuclear fusion because it's really not a concern with fusion.
Because, so what does a meltdown, quote unquote, look like in a fusion reactor?
The closest thing is that a fusion reactor would just stop. Like
that's it.
I mean, and I like to think about this. It's been so hard for us to get it started. It just takes the smallest disruption to
shut off the reaction, right?
Yeah.
So what happens to the plasma? What does the plasma turn into whenever it gets cooled?
Just it turns into a gas eventually.
A gas.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
gotcha.
It's literally a plasma is a hotter version of a gas. Right?
Okay. So that I didn't really know.
Yeah. So there's 4 states of matter, really, right? Like solid, liquid, gas, plasma. In that order. And so once it has an energy, once the reaction stops a little bit, it'll cool into a gas probably.
And what does it cool? And what would it be cooling into in our?
Yeah, so it'll either cool into a gas or a liquid, I guess, depending on.
I mean, like what element would it be?
Yeah, right. So it'll be hydrogen.
Hydrogen gas. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be hydrogen gas.
And that's not a big deal.
Not a big deal. I mean, hydrogen gas causes the problems with fission reactors because it's like highly combustible.
Sure.
But the reason we're only really concerned about it in fission is because it might combust and then allow the radiation to leak out through some damage. And I don't think it would cool into hydrogen and helium, I should say, really. And helium might even be the predominant form, depending on the reactor. With fusion when it cools. But I mean, there's really there's hardly much radiation in these reactors. There's a bit, but it's nothing like super radioactive like we have with fission plants, and it's relatively short-lived. The concern in any type of accident scenario is not safety for like public safety or anything. It's just like, you worried about your own reactor getting damaged somehow from it.
Sure.
Right? Like if the plasma gets a little less controlled because your magnets mess up or something, then maybe you'll like burn the side of your reactor cladding or whatever. That's the concern, and it's purely just like an economic concern at that point. It's really not relating to safety.
And I would assume that all of any safety systems that we've built for the fission reactors that apply to fusion reactors are already being considered to be implemented.
Yeah, I can't even really think of any that would apply to both of them.
Oh, really? So it's a completely that kind of makes sense, I guess.
I mean, they are opposite.
Right.
They're not even different. They're opposite.
Right.
So and this is another thing that I think is important for people to realize with fusion. Fission, the whole ball game is in the self-sustaining chain reaction, right? Yes. And so that's where all the problems originate from. It's us trying to figure out how to get the chain reaction to stop, because if we do nothing, it'll keep going.
Right. It's managing the amount of reactivity.
Right. So the chain reaction is pushing forward, and we're trying to hold it back a little bit in a controlled manner. But with fusion, it doesn't want to do anything naturally. We are the ones pushing it forward with fusion, right?
Right.
So as soon as we stop pushing, it just sits back down and kind of goes to sleep or whatever. So fusion inherently just doesn't want to do anything because we're putting in such we have to go into such extreme conditions to make it work, right?
Okay.
So that's, I think, one of the important things to realize with them, that fusion is not a self-sustaining reaction, right? If something goes wrong, it'll immediately. It's more of a hassle for us to get it started again
Sure.
than for it to shut off.
And so whenever I did research on we talked about this last time you were on, but the fission reactors are somewhere in the neighborhood of like $6 to $8 billion to get going.
Yeah.
Is the fusion more expensive?
It'll probably be more expensive if I had to guess.
Sure.
The reactor that the West and China are collaborating on in France is one of the most expensive buildings in the world right now. When I wrote about this in my book, I don't know if this is true anymore. At the time, it was the second most expensive building in the world, second only to the Hadron Collider.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Which is ridiculous.
16 kilometer.
Exactly.
Is that the 16 kilometer one?
Whichever the larger one was. There's
Okay.
two.
Right.
It's probably going to be really, really expensive. Now, there's some innovations that might make it much more affordable. For example, there's a lot of innovations around magnets right now that make you, if you have stronger magnets, that means you can make the reactor smaller, essentially, right?
Okay, right.
Because you need less magnet to get the same kind of pull.
Sure.
And that is a really important technology to make it commercially viable. Because if you look at ITER, the magnets, it's kind of older technology at this point, and the magnets are so large. It's a multi-story building.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the magnets on there are strong enough to lift up an aircraft carrier, like out of the water. They're like this. This is the kind of scale we're talking about.
Jeez.
And so if you're able to reduce the level of magnets and also your cooling, therefore your cooling system, and therefore your containment system, that's what's going to make it scalable. Just allowing to make it smaller, more easily constructible, and whatnot. And that's something that I think AI is going to be really good for, this magnetic scientific research, as well as AI is going to be really good for fusion, actually, in a lot of ways. So
okay, a couple questions. Then hypothetically, how small could you make one of these things?
I would say that's an open question.
Okay.
Right now, the smaller designs, the smaller tokamak designs, which is the more traditional design, are still, probably a bit more than a story tall, if I had to guess, for the reactor vessel. And
so are the magnets the deciding factor then in how small you can?
predominantly,
like
yeah. Because the magnet actually controls how tight, the really important factor for fusion plasma in these tokamak designs, which again are these like donut-shaped toruses, is the density in the cross-section of the plasma that you're creating. So you have a donut of plasma, essentially, and then on a two-dimensional level, the cross-section in that plasma, how dense is the fuel on an atomic level to each other on that cross-section. And the plasma, that's determined by, how much fuel do you have, essentially, in a given circle.
So is that just essentially how dense it's being pushed?
Right. So the magnet influences how dense you can make it.
Okay.
And therefore, inherently, kind of, this cross-section will become smaller. And as the atoms get pushed closer together from the magnets, they're more likely to fuse.
Giving you more energy.
Is
density the right way to think about it, or is that sort of a simplified?
I think density is probably a good way to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was my other question? Oh, it was like maybe like too much of like it's like getting in the weeds of like the scientific parts of it. Oh, this is my question. Because I just don't know this. Why does making and I might just have forgotten this information, but like why does making the magnets colder make them more effective?
That's also something that I've forgotten about.
Okay. Okay.
I don't want to speak too much on that because I think I'm going to get it wrong.
Okay. Well, then we'll move on from that. Okay. So could you, or do we now? Can we now move on to your senior thesis?
Sure, we can do it.
Is there anything else we should talk about with the fusion race?
No, I think the fusion race is just in sum, I think it's a
exciting.
really good, healthy, exciting competition.
Yeah.
And especially at a time where there, I would say, other less healthy forms of competition as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we talked about this at dinner last night. So we kind of talked about how whoever wins the whoever wins the race on getting AGI or fusion, or they would essentially be able to dictate what the global
in that realm. And I think AGI, artificial general intelligence, is arguably the most important of all the races going on right now, because it'll allow you at least to be able to theoretically do any of the other realms.
Right.
Maybe, so that's probably the one that's most important right now, and that's also the one that's most directly applicable for military purposes.
Sure.
So that's kind of, I think,
so everyone's going to prioritize that first then.
I think so, yeah. And I think that's why we've seen it. The IEA, I believe it was the IEA, released a report on AI earlier this year, and I think it was in the past 3 years they've seen $5 trillion of the global economy go into AI. You'll have to listeners, you'll have to fact check me, but it's like on that scale. Pretty much since ChatGPT landed, it's like $5 trillion.
And what is the entire global GDP?
It's like over $100 trillion, but that's a lot. It's like a sizable percentage.
Yeah.
A couple percent of global GDP on anything is like a lot.
Yeah.
Right. Because the most of it is spent on relatively boring things.
Sure.
It's on like electricity or consumer products,
agriculture,
exactly,
mineral extraction.
Yeah, it's like just like basic trade is the vast majority of it. Yeah, not like these innovative products. So when you have an innovative product that's starting to soak up a sizable percentage of global GDP into its research, something serious is really going on there. Like, if I had to guess, the amount that fusion draws in investment is probably it's probably on the order of a few billion a year.
Sure.
It's like 1,000 times less at this point than AI is.
Space gets very little.
Space is like approaching a $1 trillion industry.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Tell the people about your senior thesis that you for Georgetown.
So my thesis, essentially what I wrote it on, was, my specialty in nuclear is rapidly becoming these so-called small modular reactors, SMRs, which are, most nuclear reactors are the size of 1 gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts, which is, more or less enough to power like 750,000 or 1 million homes in the U.S. That's the kind of the scale we're talking about with those. Small modular reactors are a new technology coming down the pipeline, which are essentially, nuclear power has become expensive because of the regulatory hurdles and because it's just such a big construction project and it always gets delayed. Because building big things is really hard. Who would have guessed? So SMRs are smaller reactors. And they definitionally, it's anything 300 megawatts or less. So, about a third the size of these traditional reactors. And one of the big pushes with SMRs recently is that hopefully they'll be small enough. Some of them might even be small enough to put on a container truck and drop down in the middle of wherever you want it, right? Or like put in the basement of like a hospital or a college campus or something like that to provide reliable power. So it's a really interesting technology, but something I realized looking into it more is that there's not been a big discussion on how they're going to be impacted by terrorism risks, because that's been a long issue with nuclear power. It's like, okay, if a bad actor is able to compromise your reactor and like leak radiation into the public, that's a serious hazard right there. That's not easy to clean up and expensive to clean up. But also, like I said earlier, you have these social concerns, which are arguably more important than the physical risks in some cases, right? You look at Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, especially in 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, the public reaction caused more harm than the disaster itself or the accident itself. And I can talk about that in a lot more depth if you want, but
I think perhaps for new listeners, I think we've discussed that in previous discussions.
Yeah, I think we have, probably with Dr. Mullen.
Yeah,
if I had to guess.
Yeah, but Fukushima was very
Nobody died from
Nobody.
radiation at Fukushima. There's a report that said one cleanup worker died from radiation. He got lung cancer or something like that. Nobody died from 3 Mile Island. People got exposed to less than an X-ray dose
Of radiation.
of radiation at 3
Right.
Mile Island. Like it didn't hurt anybody. But those really damaged the nuclear industry in tangible ways for decades, right? Like
Yeah.
it changed the regulations around things. It made everything stricter. So something that I'm particularly worried about right now is that these social consequences, if you have, say, an SMR deployed somewhere and a terrorist is able to attack it, even if they're not successful, you might have public concern around it. And I'm worried that that'll kill an industry before it's really had the chance to start thriving in any way, right?
Right.
Because of public fear.
When did Fukushima happen? 2014?
2011.
2011,
Yeah,
right? So,
2011.
and we were going to talk about this later, but like it's nuclear is just sort of now starting to maybe get
Get back
kickstarted again.
yeah,
So it's taken it over a decade.
It takes a long time, yeah. And so that's like one small part of my thesis, the social risks there. The larger part is analyzing the regulations that we have with current nuclear reactors and looking at gaps in the regulations relating to physical security. So like SMRs are going to be very different in a lot of ways from the current nuclear reactors. Not only are they smaller, but a lot of them are using fundamentally different fission technology.
Yeah.
It's not just in the same way that like Chernobyl's reactor was a different type of nuclear reactor than the ones we used in the West.
Yep.
Like it moderated the chain reaction in different ways and at different types of controls, which were not adequate.
Which is kind of why it failed.
Which
right?
is why it failed,
Yeah.
right? These new reactors as well are very innovative designs that some of them had been tested before, back in like the 60s and on experimental levels, but never implemented at a commercial level. So for all of those reasons, that brings unique concerns and risks with them as well. So we have to figure out a way in the US to regulate these reactors in a way that makes them safe, but also commercially viable. And at current nuclear power plants, the security requirements are insane at them for good reason.
Yeah.
And the thing is, though, at these small reactors, if they're required to maintain security forces like current reactors are, they're just not going to be affordable. Like it's just not going to make sense. You're not going to hire 30 armed guards with AR-15s and military experience to protect something that's powering like one hospital, right? Or even smaller, or like a mining site in the middle of Alaska, in like the middle of nowhere, right? So, the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they've even proposed draft adjustments to some of the laws on this. And one of the adjustments that they suggested is an ability for these SMRs to not even have physical security forces and just rely purely on passive security. And that's probably what's required to make some of them commercial. And, and I'm a big advocate of SMR technology. But there's serious concerns around that, as you might expect. Like this makes it easier for a terrorist to attack a site. And again, like I said, even if they can't actually release radiation into the environment to hurt anybody, just the public perception around that
Is enough.
Is enough, arguably, yeah.
To have it removed from the site and have...
And just like cause chaos in the public. Like this is something I talk about in the thesis. If you think about it, almost definitionally, terrorism, their goal is not to hurt people, it's to cause terror.
Right, to make people scared.
To make people scared, often in order to achieve some sort of, political gain in the end, right? Now, the most obvious way to do that is to kill people and do terrible things around the world, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be only that way, right?
No.
If you can cause terror other ways, they will. And they are very successful at it. When you look at the amount of people that, especially in the U.S., that die from terrorism, we are way more scared about it domestically than we need to be. Like, more people die every hour from car crashes.
Right.
Probably every minute from car crashes than people do in a year of terrorism or 10 years of terrorism.
Right.
You know, so it's, and another reason why they might be interested, even if it's not successful, you could imagine an organization would want to attack a nuclear reactor just to like legitimize themselves as well.
Right.
And it's like what they call in security realms, like a proof of capability.
Right.
Is one way to call it. You know?
Sure.
Just like ISIS or who, you know, Boko Haram, whatever, they could just say, look what we're able to do.
Sure.
We're able to strike your sensitive facilities, even if it's not, you know, that's what they'll say.
Sure.
We're able to strike your sensitive radioactive facilities anywhere in the world.
Right.
Like, watch out. And that would be effective, I think. So
yeah,
these
very
are,
quickly, and that could spread very far, very fast.
exactly right. They could record themselves. You know, you could imagine, again, like I think the best example is like a mining site in Alaska or Canada or something that is 30, 40, 50 miles away from any sort of development, right? Because
And it could be further than that, even.
it probably could be, yeah. A lot of these places might not even necessarily have like, you know, all season roads to them. You know, you
Right.
might have to fly in or take a boat over or something like that. If you can imagine a terrorist could get, you know, say within, even if they don't get up to the reactor themselves, if they get within, let's say 10 miles of a reactor and they fly like some suicide drones into it or something, and they record the whole thing on camera, right? And they just like ship that out to the world. That's like,
it would unfortunately go very viral.
very viral, and on multiple levels that causes fear, right? Like they don't, this is something new with drone warfare, which is that no longer do the attackers have to even be physically present at the site to attack it, right? You could argue that they could have like created mortars or something like that, but in the US, and the paper's focused on the US, we're not really worried about, or, you know, realistically, these organizations being able to like ship in like heavy weaponry into the country. Like we're going to catch most of that kind of stuff pretty quickly.
Yes.
But it's the domestic homegrown stuff that's really a concern. You can very, very easily buy a drone, a commercial drone, and make a crude bomb, attach it to it, and, you know, send it off with commercial supplies. You know, nobody wouldn't be the wiser. You just go to Lowe's for a day or something.
Right, or you go to different stores and you get the different
like it's
components, and you make it
really,
together.
really easy to make bombs. Like if you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
So I think this is like a real concern, and why I wanted to write about this for my thesis is that I realized, shockingly, that nobody had talked about this before, pretty much.
Which I thought was crazy.
It's pretty crazy to me. I've kind of scoured for peer-reviewed literature on it, and the journals have not published really much at all on this terrorism risk to SMRs. What has been published has been from the national labs from the Department of Energy, looking, pretty much analyzing how it can be managed from a physical standpoint. Like what kind of barriers can we implement? What kind of strategies can we use to delay them and whatnot? But nobody's looked at it from a policy perspective, and nobody's looked at it from a policy perspective in like the peer-reviewed literature. So I'm going to submit it to a journal. We'll see if it gets published. But I think it's a really important subject to spend more time on, like as an industry.
And weren't you initially talking about cyber threats?
Yeah,
as well?
It was funny because when I started the thesis, I actually had 4 parts to it. I had two of them are under the category of physical risks, and that becomes number 1, radiological sabotage, which is like you release radiation into the environment to cause harm. The other risk is fuel theft, where an organization could steal fuel from a reactor to later then use to develop a nuclear weapon, or even just a dirty bomb, you know, like a bomb that just like wrapped in radioactive material to spread radiation. Those are physical risks. The third one is a cybersecurity risk. There's a lot of reasons why SMRs are going to be uniquely susceptible to cybersecurity risks, mostly because the traditional nuclear power plants we have around today, it's such old technology. They didn't really use any internet or communication technology.
Yeah, you can't really like hack into it or anything like
Yeah, I mean they pretty much they use equipment that's not hooked up to anything digitally controlled really. Like most of it's all the electronics just kind of stay inside the plant. Nothing goes outside to run data or anything like that, right? And then the fourth category was the social perception risks. And what I had to do is I had to kind of shorten it down to just the radiological sabotage as the main focus. And then I touch briefly on the cybersecurity risks and the social risks.
Okay.
Because once I started writing about it and, I started thinking about this probably more than most people have thought about at this point, certainly. And I say that just because there hasn't been much published on it, right? There is some classified material published on it, so maybe it goes more in depth in that, which I do not have access to. But as far as people who are interested in publishing, it seems like I've thought about this a lot more, and I realized there's just a lot in each of these categories. So I had written 1/4 of my paper essentially at this point, and I'd hit the word cap for the requirements. I thought, wow, I've got a serious problem here. I need to narrow my scope a little bit.
Yeah.
So I did. I narrowed it down to essentially just the sabotage risks with a touch on the cybersecurity and social risks where it's like most important, I think.
Now with the fuel theft aspect, again, this might be getting too much into the weeds of the actual science. We've already done that, so who cares? So if someone was able to steal the fuel, do they still have to enrich it with a centrifuge?
Yeah, good question, and there's not a simple answer.
Okay.
It's complicated for a few reasons. It depends reactor by reactor.
Okay.
It depends how long the fuel has been sitting around. It depends on the type of reactor. Like I said, a lot of these reactors are using different technology than the current ones. So they actually they produce different types of waste than the current ones do. Some of them are more dangerous from this perspective. Like, for example, some of them will produce more plutonium as waste than current reactors do. Plutonium is great for nuclear weapons, right?
Oh, plutonium is a waste product.
Exactly.
I thought that plutonium was used in some reactor.
Well, plutonium, it's kind of both.
Okay.
It's kind of both. So you have uranium-238, it absorbs a neutron and it turns into plutonium-239, which is what's used for bombs. But then...
Oh, so one neutron changes the element.
Yeah.
I thought the protons could only change the element.
Well, it's complicated. It absorbs a neutron and then it technically radioactively decays.
Right.
And then it adds a proton. This is like...
Okay,
this gets like really. This gets into quantum mechanics really quickly.
Okay. We won't.
This is what a few weeks ago I texted you at like 4 a.m, telling you that like I felt like I finally understood quantum mechanics.
Yes.
This exact question is what I was doing that night.
Right. Okay.
This gets into like quarks and like leptons. This gets like really deep.
Okay, I don't know if we have time for that today.
Yeah, and I don't think that I could reliably explain it at this point. But so. The plutonium that's produced in the reactor then can also fission, which produces energy, or you can remove it for weapons.
Okay.
And if you're producing a higher amount than the current reactors, not all of it is going to fission in the reactor. It's going to become a waste product as well as an energy provider in the reactor.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense.
So some of them have more plutonium. The short answer to your question with centrifuges is no, probably, because it's going to be mixed up with other types of elements. So you can't simply put it in a centrifuge. You would have to chemically separate the materials.
Right.
And then get uranium, and then you could put it into a centrifuge. So it's not easy. You can theoretically do it as long as you're able to have like the chemical infrastructure to process it. Okay. And this is why most people, when we're looking at fuel theft, we're more worried about plutonium from a nuclear weapons perspective in general. Okay. And are more worried about if it's not plutonium, of a dirty bomb scenario instead of a nuclear weapon scenario.
And a
Because a dirty bomb is just any radioactive material if you just attach a conventional explosive to it.
Right.
And you can just disperse it.
Right.
You know, if you blow up a bomb on top of a skyscraper somehow
Yeah.
in New York City, you could contaminate a huge area with quite a bit of radiation. And even aside from the physical impacts, again, how scary would that be for, 10 million people in New York City? Terrifying.
That's terrifying.
So those are generally the things that we look at.
Okay.
There.
And the centrifuge, and we didn't even plan to talk about this, but I just have questions now. Do you know much? And I'm not sure because you got moved sort of with your fellowship. You got moved over into the nuclear.
I'm more in the security sphere.
The nuclear security sphere. So my understanding is the centrifuge technology is very guarded. They don't give that really out.
It is very guarded. But
what does enriching the uranium actually change?
Yeah, it changes the ratio of the isotopes. It's the isotopic composition. So uranium 238, which is the most of the natural uranium. It's like 99.7% of natural uranium is 238.
Okay.
Which is not viable for a bomb.
Right.
It doesn't have the right physical properties. The remaining few point whatever percents is uranium 235, which
that would be my guess.
Is good for a bomb.
Sure.
And a centrifuge essentially spins really fast, and because the 238 is just a little bit heavier than 235 by like the smallest amount, it pushes the 238 essentially to the outside of the centrifuge, and then there's some complicated process to extract the gas at the outside wall differently than when you extract the gas just a little bit further in.
So this is happening in gas form.
It's gas form,
is what you're doing.
Exactly. Okay. You have to turn into a gas.
Gotcha.
And then, you take these two streams of gases out. One will have just a slightly higher proportion of 235 in it because the heavy 238 has gotten pushed out. Right. And then you run it through again because it's still not going to be weapons usable, right? You have to do this thousands of times.
Okay.
Before you often get something that's viable for a nuclear weapon. And so you just run it, over and over is the simple explanation of it. And eventually you'll get something that's viable for a nuclear weapon. Now, one thing I do want to say on that real quick, though, is that another reason the SMRs are going to be fundamentally different. Most nuclear power plants today, pretty much all nuclear power plants today in the world, they use enriched uranium up to 5%, generally between 3 and 5%, okay?
Okay.
Bombs require like around 90% enriched uranium usually.
Gotcha.
And the percentage is just the percentage of uranium 235 in the material, right?
In the sample that you have.
Yeah, so it goes from like 0.3%, or maybe it's 0.7%. I think it is 0.7% actually. But it goes from 1% to 5%, right? That's the enrichment. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of the SMRs, because they're smaller, they need a higher enriched level of fuel.
Right.
To get a lot of power.
Sure. So that's a concern.
So a lot of them are going up to 20% enriched uranium.
Okay.
And this is more of a concern than you would think, because it turns out in the enrichment process, it actually gets exponentially easier to enrich up to higher levels. So 20 in terms of like, we call it separative work units in the industry. That's essentially a unit measurement of how much time and energy you have to spend separating uranium for enrichment, okay?
Okay.
To get up to 90% enriched uranium, it's like 70% of the separative work units have been expended at the 20% enrichment level. So even though
Right.
you're at 20% enriched,
Right.
you're actually like 70% of the work required
Of the way there.
has been done already. Right.
Right.
So they're
And that makes sense because you're dealing with less of the
because you're
238
getting
the
a
longer you go.
more highly concentrated sample as you go up. Right. Exactly.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
So that's a huge concern right now. So it's like
Sure.
this fuel will actually be more viable for these enrichment weapons capabilities than before. Now, granted, in the U.S., how worried are we about a terrorist going into a nuclear power plant,
Stealing it.
successfully stealing the fuel, which is a whole complicated endeavor in itself, very dangerous endeavor, because like you need radiation shielding or it'll just kill you.
Right.
You have to like handle it somehow, and then get it successfully, get out of the country, presumably with it, and then enrich it with enrichment technology that they somehow acquired. That's a pretty crazy scenario.
Yeah. That's a Mission Impossible movie.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's
We'd have to
obviously
call
something to
concrete.
be concerned about,
Yeah.
but it like realistically, that's almost impossible. But it is a concern, especially if for reactors that might get deployed in say like the Middle East in the future. Maybe not so
Sure.
much in the U.S., but if you have a reactor that gets deployed to Iraq or Saudi Arabia or wherever, yeah, I mean maybe you are able to break in and then somehow get away to the mountains and then back to some facility that you've hidden. That is a concern.
Anything else to talk about?
I think we covered that pretty good.
Okay. From what you've seen so far, what are the key differences in energy policy between Joseph R. Biden and Donald J. Trump?
Yeah, that's it. That's an interesting question. So I've written 2 Substacks on them, one on each,
Yep.
in the past probably 6-7 months, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because their energy policies are very, very similar in what they hope to achieve and different in how they go about achieving it. It's like ideologically they're aligned on it almost. They
Love
just
that.
disagree on the mechanisms to achieve it.
Right.
And they agree on a lot of the mechanisms too. Essentially, what both of them want is, as Trump's been pushing it, American energy dominance. They want America to be in control of not just our own energy security and our own energy resources, but the world's energy resources. The U.S. is the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas right now, and it has been for a few years. And every year we're increasing it. We increased it a ton under Biden, oil drilling and natural gas drilling. And Trump seems like he's going to keep increasing it. Obviously, his rhetoric says that he wants to.
Drill, baby, drill.
Drill, baby, drill. Those were his first words those were his words for his energy policy during his address to Congress. And I wrote that those were the opening lines to my Substack. Drill, baby,
Yeah.
drill. And what's interesting, I guess, is that they differ in a couple key points. They're both hugely in favor of oil and natural gas.
Yep.
They're both hugely in favor of nuclear energy. Trump does not really like renewables. And I think this is because he's probably letting the politics get the best of him, but maybe I don't quite understand.
Or he's got friends in the oil industry.
Yeah, but I mean,
tough to tell.
probably so did Biden. And
That's a good
there
point.
are strategic reasons why I think he doesn't want us to get into renewables. It's not just ideological. And I talk about that a lot in the Substack that I wrote on Trump's energy policy. But he doesn't like renewables. Biden did push for renewables, right? And EVs as well on Biden's side. Trump has not really pushed for EVs to any significant degree yet. That is something good as far as I see personally that Biden did that Trump is failing to do, because China dominates the clean energy sector in the world, right? And this explains why you can see their different approaches. Biden wanted the U.S. to be able to compete with China on clean energy. Trump sees the game is already lost on that realm to China, which arguably it is.
Sure.
Trump, instead of trying to compete with China on clean energy, is trying to keep China on dirty energy and trying to keep the world on oil, essentially, right? So instead of allowing us to compete in clean energy, we're doubling down on this legacy form of energy and trying to keep the world on it as long as possible while we have the cards, right? We are the leader in fossil fuel energy right now.
Right.
And we don't want to give up our spot at the top of the hill. And I think
Sure.
that's why Trump is doubling down on that. Now, here's something surprising, though, that Trump is competing in that Biden did not compete in. And this is a great Trump policy. Trump's focus on critical minerals right now is one of his best policies in energy, perhaps the best policy in energy right now. The Biden administration did not significantly try to compete on critical minerals, which are essentially, it's like 20, 30 elements of the periodic table that are kind of rare, and they're just really important for a lot of electronics.
Lithium,
cobalt, exactly, germanium,
magnesium,
nickel. There's a lot.
Okay.
And they're really important for particularly electronics,
Yep.
but also sensitive military applications. There's a lot of really important military applications for a lot of these. And Biden did not really try to expand the U.S. on these that much. They did in the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law. Those did make some gains on there. They opened up funding for the Department of Energy to give to help new mines open in the U.S. for some of these minerals. And those were good. But it was rhetorically and policy-wise not like a primary focus of his administration. He was focused on renewables and nuclear and oil to an extent. But the oil he kind of didn't talk about and just did.
Yeah, it wasn't too popular.
It was in the policy, but it wasn't in the rhetoric.
Yeah.
And with this, again, like I said, this is something great that Trump has done. He's really, really focused rhetorically and policy-wise on these critical minerals. And this is important because if China controls 90% of rare earth elements, which is a subcategory in critical minerals, but a lot of people use them, interchangeably. China controls 90% of their rare earth element supply chain in the world.
That's crazy.
They have a total monopoly over it. And any day they could say, and they have used it this way, they could say, okay, we're not going to trade you these important elements. And then your economy is going to crumble because you don't have the electronics or whatnot to do what you need to do. And in the same way that the Arab states in 1973 put an embargo on oil, causing an oil crisis in the U.S., China has the capability to do the exact same thing with critical minerals right now. Trump hates this, and we all should hate it.
Yeah.
And he wants us to be able to compete with China on that realm and have our own critical minerals. And what I talk about in the article that I wrote about Trump's energy policy on is that this could be a 4D chess play. It could be in the sense that if this policy was taken forward 20 years and played very smartly, we could see ourselves in a world where even if we don't build out the renewables right now, because Trump might see that as a growing dependence on China, right? More renewable adoption and EV adoption. It could be that we mine more of these critical minerals ourselves and create our own supply chain. Once we've created it ourselves, then use it to also fuel our own renewable adoption to then compete with China on that front. Because right now we simply don't have the industrial capacity to do it, number one, but more fundamentally, we don't have the minerals to supply it like China does.
And China's getting them just from mainland China.
China's getting a lot of them from mainland China. They're also getting a lot of them from Africa.
Okay.
A lot of their Belt and Road Initiative policies have created like railways and whatnot that have dual lines, one of which they use to ship minerals back to ports and then send them back to China. So earlier I said that China has 90% of rare earth. I don't remember the exact terminology I used. The precise way to put it is that they have 90% of rare earth processing capability, not mining. They mine like 60% of them.
Okay.
But they process 90%. So processing is important because that's where it becomes a rock into like an ingots or something. If you're like,
Sure.
if you're playing Minecraft, it goes from iron ore to iron ingots, right? That's the processing side.
But that process is because the actual concentration of those minerals in the rocks is so low.
Exactly.
And you have to
in
break
these
it
rare
down
earths, it's often below 1% concentration.
right. And when you talked about the deep sea mining stuff, those nodules have
Some of them go up to like 5% or whatever.
5%,
So
right.
like you might be looking at, don't quote me on these numbers, but in the order of magnitude, you might be looking at cobalt rock in Congo that has a high concentration of 0.5% cobalt, right? That's probably like a very high percentage, or maybe like 1%.
Yeah.
Versus a deep sea nodule that might have 5% or whatever. That's
And if it was in an asteroid, you would get
I don't even know.
Some
I don't know if
much higher.
anybody has any data on
any
that.
data on that.
realistically.
Okay.
Not
Because
realistically.
my understanding on that was that, well, maybe this isn't even correct at all. My understanding on that was that over time, they're obviously mixed in with rock, but they also oxidize.
Yeah, the big problem is
time.
oxidation with land-based resources.
And you don't have that potentially happening with ash.
Yeah, they're probably going to be in a more refined state. Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
Um,
So China
granted,
refines.
how fast will they oxidize when they if we bring them back? I don't know.
Oh, that's a really good.
I
didn't
don't
even
know
think
the
about
answer to that.
So China has the processing power.
China's the
90%.
processing power, and that's important as well because that's where the value add component is.
Right.
The rocks, the ores aren't really sold for all that much. They're valuable because of what the processing does,
Sure.
not because of what they do. The real value add is
What
in
they
the
can
processing
become.
point, right? Yeah. And we can't really process these minerals at all in the U.S. And so there is a 40 chess play where perhaps we'd create our own supply chains for critical minerals. And then once we've done that, we try to compete on renewables. That's the best argument for Trump's policy. And while we're trying to set up these supply chains, try to keep China and the rest of the world hooked on oil for as long as possible, because that's where we're strongest, right?
Right.
So while we are building up our ability to compete on the other energy realm, try to keep everybody hooked on where we're already dominating. That's,
Sure.
I think, the best argument for Trump's energy policy. Now, where I differ from it a little bit is that I think we should still be trying to understand how to do these renewables ourselves anyways. But that might just be a difference in opinion on the strategic level between me and Trump. But I think a lot of this is that well thought out on Trump's policy. And I get the impression that sometimes he is thinking really deeply through these things and other times he's not.
Yeah, it's very strange.
And it's hard to determine what is actually his feelings, what is he taking from his advisors, how is all this playing. But the administration as a whole, I like I said, I think 4D chess, it could be a really smart policy if it's taken forward for 20 years. And that's the big if, I guess.
That's
right?
the difficult part.
Like if
Administration
someone
change.
came in 4 years and did not care about critical minerals at all, although I think we will because it's become a big national issue at this point.
Yeah, the sort of
Yeah,
larger
then, I mean-
system that exists outside of presidential administrations. will
All
probably get
Americans
attacked.
want to compete with China. Both parties want to compete with China, right?
Yes.
There's no American that's like, you know what? Let's just let China do it. So
No.
this is something that we will need to compete with China on if we're going to have any say in the global energy future, which is important because who controls energy largely dictates global geopolitics, at least to a large extent, right? Mm-hmm. And it's also the last thing I'll mention about this, which I mentioned in that article on Trump. It's also interesting for Russia and how we manage Russia, because Russia really likes it when they're essentially a petrostate. The biggest portion of their economy comes from oil and gas.
Yeah.
Russia hates it when oil is cheap because they don't get as much money off of it, right? If you sell a barrel of oil for $100, but it takes you $40 to produce, if the price of oil drops to $60, you're now only making 20 instead of 60.
Right.
Because your production costs stay the same no matter what the market price is. And Russia really likes oil to be
expensive
because
they sell it
for more, and then they have big federal surpluses to fund wars in Ukraine and Georgia and wherever else in the future. So what's interesting is that this drill baby drill policy from Trump not only hopefully keeps the world and China on fossil fuels for longer, which helps us.
Yeah.
But it also hurts Russia quite a lot.
Sure.
Because their national budgets get eaten into. There was, oil prices have been going down over the past couple months. And there was a report that came out that said Russia's oil revenues have halved in the past 6 months, approximately.
Wow.
So we're keeping them in check.
Does that eventually, if that keeps up, does that eventually impact their ability to fight the war in Ukraine?
If it impacts their ability to get money to build tanks and stuff, sure. Absolutely. So it's a really interesting way of building the policy framework for like strategic long-term goals,
Yeah.
And you can leverage it to, get them to try and negotiate in Ukraine, which has been totally unsuccessful so far, but at least in theory it makes sense.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
If you'll let us, I hope we could put a picture of your new tattoo.
Sure.
Maybe in the episode. You got yourself a tattoo of Mars. On your right shoulder.
That's why
blade.
I didn't feel compelled to wear the hoodie this time.
Sure.
Because now it's really just embodied in me.
I'm surprised you didn't get Occupy Mars also tattooed.
It would have been too much, because the Occupy Mars is too associated with SpaceX. This goes beyond SpaceX. That's true. This is humanity.
This is true. If you were to go, the question is always, if you were on a deserted island, what 5 things would you bring? You're basically going to a deserted island.
I was going to go to Mars with 5 things.
What 5 things are you bringing with you to Mars? What are the you get to bring 5 things.
Well, okay, I have a couple clarifying questions. Am I just getting dropped in the sand and I have to?
No. You're working with a team of scientists.
Okay,
at a base.
okay.
You have a room and it's not
a survival situation.
It's not a 5-star hotel, but you have a bed and you have.
I'm in some cavern or something.
Yeah, you're in an underground cave in some sort of base situation. Okay. Yeah, you're allowed to bring 5 things with you.
Okay, so 5 things that I would personally want to have with me.
Yes. Well, yeah.
This is a really good question. I would bring certainly a 3D printer. There's probably one, but I would want to have a 3D printer.
3D printer, I like that.
I would want to bring, obviously like a computer so I can like communicate with home.
Okay.
But let's, both of those arguably would already be there.
Sure.
Personal things that I would want to bring.
Yeah.
I would want to bring. I don't know.
The PlayStation?
I mean,
bringing anything? Any entertainment you're bringing with you? Any books?
I was thinking about books too. I don't know what books I would want to bring with me that I feel like would be like useful.
Yeah. Any sentimental things you'd want to bring?
Nothing really too sentimental. The PlayStation, sure, that'd be fun. But like, how much downtime am I gonna have in a cave on Mars?
I don't think you're gonna have much.
And it would go pretty hard to play Skyrim on Mars, though. Now that I think about it,
that would go insanely.
That would be sweet.
Skyrim on Mars. Yeah.
I'd bring my digital collection of The Office.
There you go.
That.
Okay, sure. So you're bringing some entertainment with you.
I'd bring The Office with me. I will say, I don't think I have a good answer for you, but I will tell you one thing that I really want to do on Mars, though.
Okay, and what's that?
I want to go into a Mars cave or whatnot.
Yeah.
And stencil my handprint into a wall,
That is that's
just like the prehistoric humans
like the
did
Paleolithic humans
all
did.
over the world.
Yeah, that John Green video was great.
It
that
was
he did
that's
about that.
what made me think of this.
Yeah, that's
That's
great.
what made me think of this.
That's amazing. Yeah, we certainly have to do that whenever
Yeah,
we.
I think it would be really, I think it would be sentimental and it would just have a lot of meaning behind it. You know,
Definitely.
even if it doesn't work out, maybe in a million years, someone else will go back and say they were here.
Right.
You know?
And that's interesting. Would you, if you were there and the situation allowed for this, would you, and I forget the name of the mountain, but there's a mountain on Mars that is 5 times taller than
Olympus
Mount
Mons.
Yeah, yes.
It's the tallest mountain in the solar system.
Yes. Now, because of the reduced gravity and the lack of atmosphere, is that easier then to climb? It's obviously a much longer walk to the top.
It's easier. You can jump higher.
Right.
You're not as weighed down. Granted, our muscles are also going to atrophy and our bones are going to atrophy with the reduced gravity.
We're assuming you're working out to try to keep the muscles
so
going. Would you climb it?
It's actually something I've thought about before. I would love to climb it.
Imagine the selfie you could.
I would
get
love
at the
to
top
be
of.
the first person to climb it. I'm not that fit. I could probably get fit enough to do it if I really
You
wanted
could,
to.
for sure. I mean, if you're going to Mars, you're gonna have
Most
to.
people, I think, are like genetically capable
Yeah.
of getting fit enough to climb Everest or something if they really wanted to.
Sure, if they wanted to, yeah.
I feel confident that I could as well in Mons. Although I think if I tried to do it, there's a pretty high chance that I die.
What?
Like the first people that climbed Everest, didn't
yeah.
some like crazy high proportion of them die before they even got to the summit?
I'm so stupid. In my head, there's like a path.
There is now. Today there is.
I meant on Olympus Mons. I'm
But
like, in my head, there's like a trail you can walk.
No, right. Granted, so you have to make your own path if you're going to be the first person or the first few people.
Yeah.
Granted, I do think the reduced gravity is going to be super helpful because you'll be able to, the gravity's whatever. It's a third, I think, of Earth gravity
something like
approximately.
that.
So you can, in theory, jump 3 times higher.
Well, you could carry a lot more. You could also
Carry
more
3 times more
equipment.
weight,
Yeah,
right.
you could carry more.
Again, like I said, though, your body is going to adapt to its environment. So how much stronger are you actually going to be proportionally is an open question.
Right. You could jump higher.
If I was as strong as I was right now going up it, I think it would be relatively doable. It would not be easy, certainly.
Sure.
Someone who climbs Everest could probably do it, if I had to guess. And there was a path, let's say.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In my head, I was thinking like, just walk up it.
But it's something I've thought about before. I would love to do it. Yeah.
That view has to be breathtaking.
I'm
really.
sure that it is. Probably one of the
amazing.
best in the solar system.
It's got to be.
Yeah. Also, because Mars is smaller, so the horizon is closer. So
And the stars must be beautiful. There's no
stars
light
are probably there's no light pollution. There's not even an atmosphere to stop it.
Right.
And you're farther from the sun, so there's
And
not
you're much
even-
higher up.
And yeah,
You have everything going for you to get a better.
yeah. I mean, the reason that it's important being higher up in Earth is because the atmosphere gets in the way.
Right.
I imagine the view is immaculate. Now, how the view compares to the space right over, I don't know, but
Sure.
I'm sure that it's something to, I hope somebody, if not me, will plant some sort of flag on the top of Mars. We need like a human flag.
We do. Yeah, we need like a human flag.
The UN or something. I don't know. Maybe
No, the Americans would, of course. Everybody would try to put their own flag.
it would go pretty hard to put the American flag on Olympus Mons.
It would be
at the top. It would be
crazy.
pretty
a
awesome.
big flag.
Yeah. Yeah, you know how like a few years ago Russia planted a Russian flag at the bottom of the North Pole, like in the Arctic
that?
Ocean? Yeah. They planted a Russian flag in the sea at the bottom of the North Pole.
That goes kind of hard.
It goes pretty hard.
That goes pretty hard. I'll give them that. That does go pretty hard.
Yeah.
Wow. All right.
I
Well,
would like to do that, yeah.
That would be very cool. Well, hopefully we have some. Hopefully there's some way to do a podcast on Mars.
Oh, there's certainly got to be.
I
Not
would love to
remotely. You have to come with.
I would love to do a podcast on Olympus Mons, like on the peak, and then bust out the studio and set everything up. We'd have to weigh some stuff down. We don't want the camera floating away.
Yeah, I don't know what the wind. The wind is probably not too bad.
Right?
1% of the atmosphere.
Not a lot of atmosphere. Yeah,
Right.
not a lot of wind.
And it'll be even less than 1% up at Olympus
Yeah,
Mons.
yeah. So maybe the next time we see you will be on the red planet.
Yeah, that would be
On Olympus Mons. How that would be. Can you imagine the set? That would be a breathtaking
crazy.
set.
Crazy.
It'd be amazing.
I'm certain. Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Well, thanks, Jeremiah. It was good chat. We're almost at timer, so we're gonna have to wrap up.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, thanks for stopping by.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Even though I was the one that stopped
Yeah.
by, but thanks for stopping by.
Stopping by in the video.
Yeah, right.
And
Yeah, right.
on the channel.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, good chat.
All right, thanks.
And we'll hopefully have you on again sometime soon. But
Hopefully
yeah.
before
You go to Mars. Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully that paper gets published. If the paper gets published, we'll have you back.
Yeah, I would. We'll see what happens with it.
Of course. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you later.
Thanks.